Hey everyone, Mick Levinskas here with Navitas Ventures, and I'm chatting to Ash, who's in New York. Ash, how you going?
It's going really well, Mick. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too. And you spent a few years working in EdTech and run a number of programs there in New York. Can you tell me what you work on as a starting point?
Sure. Well, I guess the more question is what am I not working on?
Yeah.
Just as context, I founded a company about 4 years ago called Start Ed. We focus on attracting and developing an army of education innovators to solve the world's largest challenges. We're also trying to turn New York and the East Coast into a hub for education innovation, crack open the nut that is New York for everyone around the world and across the US in terms of fundraising and market access. And of course, the brand presence that is associated with working in the space. I tend to work with any founder solving a problem from early childhood through K-12, higher ed, corporate learning, and adult learning. Usually it's idea to Series C. That's kind of the space we're in. When we work with a given company, they usually tend to choose their own adventure based on the problem they need to solve. We'll work with them on an ongoing basis or for as short as a day or a week, depending on the stage. We also produce something called New York Tech Week, which I like to say is like a fashion week for education. But unfortunately, no one else says that. What other people say is it's kind of more like a combination of Broadway and EdTech, and that's because we get a lot of performers from New York to build a frame, edutainment frame around the problems in the space.
Yeah, Ashen, you've been in EdTech for so long. You must have seen the trends changing pretty dramatically, certainly over the last 10 years. What education technology has always, everyone's been saying it's going to be massively disrupted at some point. Do you think we've hit the tipping point of big disruption? I've got 3 kids in school, 4, 6, and 8, and I see hints of it, but it's basically, it seems to be more increments than it is this mass disruption. What do you think that is coming, or do you think it's going to be 1,000 tiny changes rather than a big tipping point?
So interesting that you use the word 1,000 there, because it's my opinion that the industry is about 1,000th of the size it could get to. And that's based on me reading a bunch of various things and extrapolating a little bit.
Sorry, actually, do you mean education or education technology specifically?
Let's discuss the difference,
yeah.
Right?
Okay.
So for me, I'm defining almost any process that can be transformed through digital learning as education, right?
Yep.
So it's not just learning about self-driving cars. It's about learning about how to put them together as an engineer, all the way to how to manufacture the components, to a senior citizen learning how to use the technology of a self-driving car, right? So
yep.
Anything in between. And if you tend to look at education as the full learning life cycle, from birth to when you decide not to stop learning, there's 5 different verticals that I tend to see: early childhood, K-12, higher ed, learning while working, that's the future work, and then adult learning / consumer learning. If you frame it that way, then it's a $6 trillion market. And I'm saying that $6 trillion is probably closer to the 1,000x that most people recognize today.
Right. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. And I think it's going to be, so that the fact that it's still not fully achieving its potential, is that because of the change we're in terms of actual work and learning, or is it still because we've still got so many hang-ups in terms of old school, not just old school systems, but old school systems of schooling, What's holding us back?
I think it's because humanity is still young, right? Because I think the real disruptive change probably comes in 20, 30 years when some element of bioengineering meets learning, and then we're learning in very fundamentally different ways. Until those days come, I think in the meantime there are some very disruptive technologies. Like the usual suspects: AI, VR, blockchain. I'm seeing them applied interestingly, but you brought up interest quite earlier when you said there's a lot of small changes. I think it's because people tend to create tools, not companies. And I think if we took the 16,000 companies out there and aggregated them into 1,600, then we're probably creating significant companies that can really change a particular process or set of people's lives, right? I think it's partially because of this kind of niche focus and the specialization, but also because of the nature of the industry and how disparate it is.
Yeah, that's really true, and I think it's I see the interest significantly increasing, and good companies in education technology have always been funded, but it's not traditionally been a hot sector like just AI, VR, robotics by itself, even e-commerce and SaaS. And part of that has been the go-to-market challenge. Um, I certainly see in terms of a lot of private schooling and not necessarily homeschooling, but total schooling, I guess, of K to 12 mainly, where a lot of the dollars seems to go. That's still the case, but it is changing. It's changing slowly. Do you see a change in appetite for investors in edtech? Is that getting better or changing in any fundamental ways?
Yes, is the short answer. I think the realities of the situation is that the industry is so young that a lot of somewhat unwise bets were made earlier on, and then we saw the fallout from that, and then people got smarter and started making fewer investments but larger ones. So every industry goes through that learning curve, right? So we're actually over the hump, which is now people are smarter and making bigger bets, but fewer of them. I think the other influencing factor is that the current group of companies that are launching are probably going to exit within the 5 to 7 year time frame, rather than the companies we see exit today, which were created 10, 20 years ago. Right. So we're seeing that speed up, but it's still 5 to 7. So
yeah.
So it's still a long time. I'd say that cycle doesn't become shorter, not in K-12 and higher ed in the US for certain, but it might get much shorter in workforce development, learning in the workforce, and also interestingly, the connective tissue between the phases of learning. So K-12 to higher ed to the workforce, and then I think a very ignored space is what happens after we stop working, and I think that's a big area as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There are so many different aspects of it, and I think the other challenge I think with education has been, if you think about the startup question people ask is, are you a painkiller or a vitamin? And real education outcomes. I could read a tweet and have a 3-minute conversation and learn something, but it takes 1,000 of those combined to have a real, a deep and meaningful educational outcome, which will change my employability or value, ability to create value, which is one of the harder things about education. It seemed to be a soft tool that has a soft impact. But I mean, there's a lot of work now on nano degrees and nano credentials and things like that. Do you think that's the direction we're going to be heading? Is much more smaller scales, but repeated more often rather than a 4-year degree?
Yeah, so I think we've gone from chunks of learning that last 4 years to chunks of learning that last a few seconds. and that's actually become prevalent just in the course of 10, 20 years. So so the chunk size of learning is changing. I think that's a function of the amount of information that one has to deal with in the modern day, right? So that's a necessary change. In traditional learning, and when I say traditional learning, I'm talking about post-secondary. Usually, there's three reasons we used to go to school, and that was to get access to a high-quality network, high-quality content, and high-quality experts. Those three things are disaggregating because you can find those things in separate places now, all except for the network, right? So you can find high quality content anywhere on the internet. Experts you can read by the hour, again, smaller chunk sizes. But the network still remains kind of a prevailing competitive advantage for those who choose to pay for it. So
by that, I'm guessing you mean a deep and meaningful network, not a hey, add me on LinkedIn.
Oh yeah, I'm not talking about followers. I'm talking about kind of your a tribe that thinks along the same rules.
Yep, I understand. Yeah, that makes sense.
So there's kind of intrinsic rules built in.
Yeah. Have you seen any good? I've seen a lot of companies try to do that. I know certainly Open Learning, a company I was involved with, is trying to do more collaborative learning, and Minerva is trying to do more collaborative learning. Have you seen anyone tackle that directly?
I mean, the people who still do it best are still called Harvard, Stanford, MIT, right? Because there's some brand association with that. There are smaller networks that aren't publicly accessible that do function well, but they don't tend to think of themselves as learning organizations. I mean, I used to be at Techstars, and Techstars doesn't consider itself a learning organization, right? Even though it's probably one of the strongest networks of founders out there. So there's almost this question of whether you are an education company or not, even though you're tackling the space. So this goes back to, how do you define education?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It is a complex and a really, really important issue. I think it's widely considered by many, including myself, to be the silver bullet on a lot of issues around both inequality and racial harmony, and it is complex and happens in so many different ways. Again, with 3 kids and myself, just recognizing the difference of feeling around that. I mean, there's also a competitive angle, which is interesting because it kind of feels like if sometimes it's like, hey, let's get everyone more educated. That's great, but if I need a competitive advantage to get a job, to be paid well for my economic well-being, then I want to get a better education than somebody else. That there is a more competitive angle, and I think that goes to the brand value of the MITs, NYUs, Oxford, Stanfords, etc. Is that you're trying to get an advantage over and above purely the content, which is often more commoditized. But then lynda.com gets acquired for $1 billion, and you're like, wow, content is still valuable.
Certainly, I can't wait to see the next generation of billion-dollar companies. I think a fair number will actually come out of China, and I think interestingly, it'll be the companies that plug in perfectly with the Chinese ecosystem, but might not necessarily be from there. I almost every couple of weeks, I see a US company come back from doing a tour in China with their eyes twice as wide as when they went. When they realize that A plus B equals, a couple of $1 billion.
Yeah. Can you, what are the 3 different, for those who don't know the China market well, can you give us some of the highlights of what makes it such a different environment for education technology, or education generally?
But just from, I'll start with the very basics and probably get more complex. So from a very basic standpoint, you have probably the largest consumer market that occurred overnight. So that occurred overnight part actually is important because you have a lot of the need that the middle class had when they transitioned from a low middle class to a middle class in the US, but almost 10 times that, right? So that happened a couple of decades ago in the US. Now it's happening in China, and it's much larger. So a lot of spending power. The second is cultural, right? The education in lots of European parts of the world, or the West, tends to be seen as an expense, whereas in Asian cultures, investment it's seen as an investment. And I think that fundamental shift of how a parent treats education, and then spending probably the largest expenditure they would make on their kids, and how society recognizes that expenditure, basically creates kind of full self-fulfilling prophecy of large markets being created. So those are, I think, probably the two fundamental issues. The second is China is yearning to break beyond its own wall, and especially the newer generation. So anything that is teaching kids how to tell stories better, whether that be in English or not, is interesting, right? Because storytelling is a very unique skill set, and it's very cultural. The second, I think, is that the government is able to distribute solutions much quicker than they are. So in creative and higher in the US, you have almost a friction when you're approaching the space. But in China, if you are able to tap into that network, then distribution happens much quicker. So I think I'll probably stop there. There's probably more nuances to that, but I think that's probably why A plus B equals a couple $1 billion in China.
Yeah, I think I'd echo your. So I just lost internet for a second there. Have I got you, Ash?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Yeah, the one thing I would echo there is go to China. Like, if you haven't been, it's a big trip, and there is quite good people, I think, to connect you. And please, anyone watching, feel free to reach out to me about this. But it's definitely worth going just to be able to see. And I don't think you can actually get a full sense of it until you go, based on a number of those different elements. So, and just a quick reflection on the fact that I think, as someone with kids in US schools at the moment, but also experience with Australian schools, the US sees obviously a massive cost investment with college education in terms of student loans, etc., and families saving up. But there is significantly less investment, I think, in terms of elementary and pre-K, and even high until sort of late high school. It's like, okay, now you got to get into college.
Right.
It's a very, very skewed. And then typically, again, after you finish college, it's like, oh, I'm done with education. So I think there's a lot of shifts, certainly across the US, that are a rebalancing of the force around edtech, so for education generally. So, and just Ash, is there any particular company that you've seen recently which got you super excited that you'd like to share with everyone?
I love. I'm supposed to love all my kids equally, right? There are a few that I really appreciate, and I'll tell you one that I'm not invested in, but I missed out on. There's a company called Classcraft that I really enjoy, not just their product, but also how the founders think. They're a Canadian company, and they're putting a fantasy layer over the K-12 classroom, and they're creating a new category of solution that they're calling an engagement management solution, as separate from a learning management system or anything else. So engagement management is clever framing, but also kind of talking about the root cause of what most educators tend to have to deal with, which is that students don't necessarily pay attention to it because they don't see it in their own self-interest. But these guys, when they initially launched, BBC picked them up. They went viral. They went from several hundred schools to several thousands almost overnight. And I think solutions like that put a layer that is addressing the root cause of why content transfer doesn't necessarily work from educator to student. Really see scope, and I can't wait till to go to China.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, yeah, great. And tell me, when's the next big when's your big events on this year in New York?
Well, the best kept secret in the industry is that we actually do events every single week,
Wow.
just for a few dozen people. But then every quarter for a few hundred, and then every year for a few thousand. So New York EdTech Week is January 6th, 2020, the first education innovation event of the decade.
Okay. Oh, wow, of course. Huge. Oh, well, love to be there. That sounds really exciting. And like, Ash, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing some of your insights. Congratulations for your continued success there in New York, driving that and really growing. I think it's a worthy cause in terms of the impact, as well as supporting these companies, because EdTech is hasn't been well. No startups are easy, but I think education particularly has challenges. And I really hope we're on the precipice of some significant positive change. Certainly, I hope by the time I sort of have this view that I don't think any of my kids will drive a car. And I certainly hope that by the time they get to tertiary education, that it's significantly different than it is now, because it should be significantly more impactful. So, yeah, exactly. Well, thanks for sharing. Hope to get together with you directly at some point soon and talk more about EdTech. Great to chat and get your insights.
You too. Cheers.
Cheers.